Alrighty, okay, so good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on disease and fungicide resistance risk management in the high rainfall zones. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Australian Fungicide Resistance Extension Network, or AFREN for short. My name is Kylie Island, I'm the Extension Coordinator for AFREN, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. So before we get started, just some brief housekeeping. If I can grab the next slide, Nick. So just generally, I'm sure we've been through many Zooms already. Everyone should automatically be muted. Please keep it that way. To ask a question, please go to the Q&A window in the bottom of your screen and answer through that way. In the unlikely event of a webinar hacking, the webinar will be shut down and you'll get a new link sent to you. And please be kind. So if you can just, next slide, Nick. Just to provide a bit of background on that Q&A, you can send it anonymously through the little Q&A link that's on, should be at the bottom of your screens. You can send through on the chat as well. That will be, depending how you send it, it'll be public or not. And yeah, we're really keen to get your questions throughout the webinar and answer as many as possible. Next slide. Yep, so just as some background, the AFREN project is a GRDC initiative and it's born out of the recognition that fungicide resistance is a serious and increasingly prevalent problem in Australian grains crops. So our remit is to deliver regionally specific resources and training to help growers and advisors understand the status, risks and management of fungicide resistance in Australian grains. And to do that, we're developing and delivering a fungicide resistance management guide, workshops, information sessions and webinars such as today, as well as fact sheets, updates and email alerts. And you can get a lot of those resources on the website. To do all of this work, we're really fortunate to have been able to harness the skills and expertise of regional plant pathologists, fungicide resistance experts and comms and extension specialists across the country. So fungicide resistance is a little bit different in each growing region and each area, so it's really important to get the right information for your current situation and the general risks to your area. So on the call with us today from the AFREN team, we have Lauren and Bridget from our communicators in the background, helping with technical and comm support. We have Fran Lopez, if you can give us a wave, who's joining us from the Centre for Crop and Disease Management at Curtin University, who is our expert in fungicide resistance diagnostics and management. And our star, I'm really pleased to have Nick Poole with us today. He won't be a stranger to many of you. Who's from the Foundation for Arable Research Australia. So Nick is the Managing Director of FAR Australia, an independent applied research and extension organisation serving the cropping industry in Australia. He graduated in the UK and has 35 years experience as a research agronomist, having worked in the UK, New Zealand and Australia. His specific interests are disease management and challenging the current boundaries of wheat productivity worldwide. That's a big ask there, Nick. He is a fellow of the Royal Agricultural Society of England and a recipient of the GRDC Seed of Light Award. So without further ado, I now pass over to Nick to enlighten us on disease control in the high rainfall zone, managing fungicide resistance risk.
Yeah, many thanks, Kylie, and I hope you'll excuse me not wearing my mask. I do have my mask here. Hopefully you'll give me the newsreader's view and allow me to speak without my mask. I find it steams up my glasses, which is a bit of a problem with regards to seeing my script. But I can assure you I'm in my isolated office at this moment in time. So disease control in the high rainfall zone, a topic that I will have spoken with many of you about over the years. Today's title very much in the context of managing fungicide resistance in the high rainfall zone. And we are quite literally in the high rainfall zone on the front line for fungicide resistance. Why is that? Put simply, our environment, our longer growing season, which confers those productivity benefits, actually results in us most of the time using more fungicides than the main Australian grain belt. So our seasons are longer, there's more potential for rainfall, and as you know, humidity is the great driver of most of the foliar, if not all of the foliar diseases. So we apply more fungicides, and a number of the pathogens, not all the pathogens, but a number of the pathogens that are prevalent in the high rainfall zone are ones that we've started to note with the expertise of CCDM. We've started to note that they are beginning to show the signs of resistance. And I'm going to talk to you about both resistance and reduced sensitivity today, and I'm going to try and make clear the distinction between the two. So what is our risk? Well, as I say, higher disease pressure in the high rainfall zone really equals more applications, and more applications, particularly if they're of a single mode of action, are actually going to be problematic to us in terms of creating more selection pressure. So in other words, exposing the fungus to that fungicide for longer because our season goes longer, and therefore our disease pressure is potentially longer. Not all pathogens are affected in the same way. So we know, for example, that pathogens that have the ability to sexually reproduce and exchange their genetic material have the possibility of producing mutations along the way that could effectively start to affect our fungicide performance. We also know, because of the experience with probably the most significant of our early diseases to acquire resistance, which was barley powdery mildew in WA, we know that they're tended to be associated with pathogens that produce high spore loads. We've a reference there on the slide, you can see, to short latent periods. But as I'll show you in this presentation, one of the diseases that's problematic in the high rainfall zone of the eastern states is Septoria tritici. And it, whilst having a number of cycles, polycyclic, does not have a short latent phase. So those are some general aspects around the pathogen. And it's important to recognize that some pathogens, for example, some of the cereal rusts at the moment, are probably much lower risk in terms of resistance development. We also know that with good agronomic practices that tend to pull levers that reduce disease pressure, and combined with less susceptible genetic material, we can considerably reduce our risk of both disease and with it the risk of fungicide resistance, because in effect we'll use less fungicide. Earlier I mentioned this aspect of pathogens acquiring resistance and in some cases reduced sensitivity. What exactly do I mean? One of the things with resistance, and we have a great example in Europe, in New Zealand, of what we refer to as QOI, or Group 11 fungicide resistance to the Septoria, or the Septoria pathogen rather, has resistance to the QOI or strobilurine fungicides. Now that resistance was acquired, say, in New Zealand, and I was there for the 3 years that it took effect. Over 3 years, we had a population of Septoria that moved from being sensitive to all of our commonly used fungicides in the strobilurine category, so things like Amistar, things like Paraclostrobin, that's in products such as Opera. We moved from those products working very effectively 3 years later to them having no effect whatsoever. In other words, you could pour on those QOI fungicides and they wouldn't control Septoria tritici. That change in the population was actually and is actually due worldwide to the same mutation independently generating. So in other words, selecting for a mutation that exists in that population, whether it be an Australian population or a European or a New Zealand population. It's a one-step move, and when we move to that mutation, the resistant individuals cannot be controlled. And it's important to recognize there that sometimes you may get a drift back towards the resistant individuals being sensitive if the mutation doesn't have as good survival characteristics in the population. However, with the mutation that affects strobilurin in Europe and New Zealand in Septoria tritici, there is no shifting back. Strobilurins just don't work any longer. That has to be contrasted with something we call reduced sensitivity. And this is particularly appropriate with our triazole fungicides. And our triazole fungicides act on the proteins that produce fungal cell membrane. And in fact, that factory, for want of a better description, that produces those cell membranes actually undergoes very slight multiple step mutations that gradually shift the population from being sensitive to the fungicide to being resistant to the fungicides. But actually there are many steps potentially in between where small differences in mutations can accumulate within that manufacturing base, which is coded for by what we call the CYP51 gene. And it's important to recognize that that gradual shift from sensitive to resistance in the group 3 fungicides can actually take place over years, or in the case of Europe, over decades, where small changes gradually erode the performance of those DMIs. It can also be used, though, reduced sensitivity, to describe a mutation that is very resistant, but actually is a small percentage of the population. So when we talk about reduced sensitivity, remember that it's a gradual shift towards resistance, some of which is only detectable in the lab up to the stage where you start to experience it in the field. So we have lab detection, which you might not see in the field of a mutation that's making the fungicide less effective, through to reduced sensitivity, through to full-blown resistance. What does our rogues gallery look like in terms of where we're finding resistance and to what groups? Now, I emphasize that the spots on this map don't represent the exact spot it's been found. It's more a reference to the state that it's been found. I'm going to concentrate on the cereals, in particular Septoria tritici today. But what you can see is that over probably the space of the last 8 years, we have found through the work of CCDM and New South Wales DPI this list of mutations occurring in the population, which we can see in the lab in some cases. We can see represented by reduced performance in the field or reduced sensitivity, to full-blown resistance where those products don't work. But if you look carefully, what you can actually see is that our rogues gallery probably in cereals is very much looking like this. And that is that the fungicide management decisions we make in the high rainfall zone around these three common diseases are the ones we need to be looking at in particular and just monitoring the performance of our fungicides, making sure that they work in the way we're expecting them to work. And you can see that some of what we're seeing with fungicides is occurring in actually only the last 12 months. So form of net blotch has now been found in regions of South Australia, in particular the Yorke Peninsula, to actually the pathogen itself has overcome the SDHIs. Now, in this particular case, we're talking about the pyrazole SDHIs, things like Sustiva seed treatment, which is what it was noted in, and also products that contain SDHIs, such as Aviator X-Pro. Now, that's, at the moment, something that we're seeing in Yorke Peninsula in its worst state, but we're finding that mutation in other places in South Australia. Wheat powdery mildew, resistant to strobilurine fungicides, is now actually being found in both Victoria, SA, and Tasmania. And some of those developments have occurred only in the last 2 years, particularly the move into South Australia. In those cases, we're increasingly finding, and I know this from Southern Victorian work that we were doing only last year, strobilurins aren't working. They're not working against powdery mildew. And lastly, the disease I most want to concentrate on is Septoria Tritici Blotch, where New South Wales were surveying back in 2017 and showing that we've actually got reduced sensitivity to a number of our DMIs, and some of them more seriously than others. And it's these three that I want to cover, but particularly Septoria Tritici. Septoria Tritici as a disease is now endemic across the high rainfall zone of the eastern states. And it's problematic to control. Why is it difficult to control this disease? Well, if you look at it, the first thing is it's nowhere near as easy to control as the cereal rusts were that we had through the 2000s. The other thing we're noticing, probably because of susceptibility in some of our germplasm, it's moving out of the high rainfall zone into the medium and low rainfall zones, even though we've had some pretty dry seasons. Now, sure, it does need that wet weather, but we think that susceptible varieties and probably a move to earlier sowing is encouraging that move of Septoria Tritici into some of those other rainfall zones outside of the HRZ. Another key part of Septoria Tritici's epidemiology is that it's got a very long latent period, and that disguises its development in a crop, which makes the management of it for advisors and growers much more difficult. We perhaps aren't blessed with as much genetic resistance as we'd like to see, and I'll come back to this in a second. Lastly, however, it is this aspect of fungicide resistance. In Europe, as I say, in New Zealand, the strobilurine group 11 QOIs do not work against Septoria Tritici. Here in Australia, they do work, but it's an area that really concerns me with regards to the future if we overuse our strobilurins such as azoxystrobin to control Septoria Tritici, because we know that the pathogen has overcome that disease elsewhere. Let's look at some of those points in a little detail. Here's an indication of the resistance ratings that we've got in some of our common high rainfall zone. And this isn't an exhaustive list, my apologies, but it's probably some of the more popular varieties that will be grown in the longer season HRZ regions, particularly in the eastern states. And like I say, at this moment in time, Tritici is not a problem in the high rainfall zone of the west. And so I haven't included ratings from that region. But what you can see is that there isn't a lot of genetic resistance within our germplasm that's commonly being used. However, it's important to recognize that an MS rating can confer significant advantages in terms of just being that bit less susceptible, particularly if it comes to wanting to sow a variety early. So the worst probable combination, because early sowing is a large lever that encourages Septoria tritici, probably because we can get more cycles of the disease in. But one of the things with sowing earlier is, if you can, try not to pick those sucker or most susceptible varieties. The other aspect, as I mentioned earlier, that requires us to know a little bit about how this disease ticks, for want of a better description. So let's just have a look at some of the phases by which the disease spreads. And I'll keep this rather brief because there's far better people like Grant, who will be speaking to you in a future webinar, to take you through this in detail. But broadly speaking, this is a stubble-borne disease where we have that first phase of spore release, the ascospores from the stubble, that happens in that autumn period with spores that can travel long distances. That sets up infections that we begin to see in June and July, and it's those lesions at the base, on the basal leaves of the crop, that under wet conditions will exude from the pycnidia the spores or conidia that splash up or rub up in windy, wet weather and transfer the disease up the canopy. Really important, though, that one remembers that what you see in early spring with Septoria tritici in the crop is probably what you're going to deal with, because you don't tend to get a lot of spore movement off the stubbles the following spring. Most of that initial spore movement from the stubble is in the autumn and early winter. So when you look at a paddock in early spring at growth stage 30 and you're trying to work out how much infection you've got, generally speaking, you would say that what you're looking at there is what you're going to be managing. And that's completely different to rust that can come over the fence at you later in the season. So bear that one in mind. If you haven't got evidence of Septoria tritici at growth stage 30, 31, it's unlikely that you're going to have a bad season for tritici. And it's one of the reasons that spring wheats don't really suffer from this disease. You don't get that spore movement from the stubble in the spring. As an advisor, though, one of the key things to remember with this disease is it's got a very long latent phase. And that long latent phase tends to disguise the advance of the disease. So even if you've got wet weather, as the crop stem elongates, the latent phase, which we talk of in degrees C days as being 250 degrees C days, can actually mean that you can have 2 and a bit leaves emerging that look clean before the advance in front of the fungus is visible to you. So by the time you get to flag leaf, you may say, well, I haven't got any infection in the top leaves, the crop looks clean. But actually, by knowing that it's been extremely wet through stem elongation, if you had disease in the base of that crop, it tells you that you may well still be incubating the disease in those upper leaves. So remember to look at diseases in this latent phase for Septoria as having a very long latent phase, and the thermal time for a leaf to emerge can mean that you can have 2 leaves that emerge before you actually see the infection in the next leaf down. So it's only when you get to flag leaf that you then begin to see the disease catch up and consume in infection those upper leaves. So bear that long latent phase in mind. Lastly, though, it is this aspect of reduced sensitivity that I want to actually remind you of. The survey that Andrew Milgate and his team did in 2017 clearly showed that we now have a Septoria population that has acquired a more sinister mutation in the form that Andrew describes it as the isoform 11 strain. In Europe, they call it, as I understand it, the R8 strain. Now, this confers reduced sensitivity to the group 3 DMIs, and in particular on the mainland seems to affect tebuconazole, to a lesser extent propiconazole, and all of those DMIs to a certain extent, but not as much as tebuconazole and propiconazole. In Tasmania, where this strain is even more defined as being perhaps dominant to 100% in the population, flutriafol is clearly failing the growers to give the control of Septoria that it used to. Those are all reasons to be aware of what's happening when you apply fungicides to your crops for Septoria control. So what actually works? What fungicides work? For Australia, with its collaborators, has been doing work looking at this particular aspect of fungicide management. And we worked on a GRDC funded project in the high rainfall zones of SA, Vic and Tas, looking at fungicide performance. And what I'm going to show you now is some experimental results. Please note, in these experimental results, I've applied, or we've applied, I should say, the fungicide twice. So the same fungicide applied twice. In commercial situations, please don't do this one at home, is the way I would refer to it. So what fungicides are working? This is a 2018 piece of work from Southern Victoria, and I can tell you that Southeast South Australia gave us very similar results. It's where we've applied different dose rates to get a feel for the sensitivity differences. And what you can see is that we're looking at the level of Septoria control that we're getting on the 3rd leaf down, flag -2, with different products applied through their rate range. What you can see is that our mixture products, like such as Radial, which is a combination of a DMI and a QOI, in that case epoxyconazole and azoxystrobin, is working very well. Aviator Expro, in this example, applied between 60 and 100% dose, also working well. That's bixafen and prothioconazole. What you can, though, see there is that we're still getting good control at the label rates, the full label rates of products such as Prosaro, epoxyconazole in the shape here of Opus 125, and ciproconazole, which we can't access, but is present in products such as Amistar Extra, which is a mixture of ciproconazole and azoxystrobin. Those all seem to be working well in comparison to tebuconazole, which definitely doesn't seem to be as effective as what we might have expected it to be from historical results. I put that information up on the basis that we aren't looking at products that have failed to give control of Septoria tritici at this moment in time. In other words, we don't have full-fledged resistance. But it's certain that where we've got this R8 strain, we are not getting the level of control from tebuconazole, probably propiconazole and flutriafol to anything like the degree that we would expect. And be aware that all of these products may well be shifting downwards in their efficacy against this disease. So keep your eye on it, particularly where you've used a mixture of QOI and DMI, because the QOIs, at the moment, we have no evidence that there's resistance, but we would expect it with this pathogen. Lastly, timing. A really good foolproof timing approach for wheat, generally speaking, and for triticide is based on a 2-spray strategy for those more susceptible varieties, and in Tasmania, possibly needing to go to a 3rd spray. And I show you here 2 targets where I'm portraying the window when those 2 applications could be most effective. Bear in mind that in some seasons in the high rainfall zone, if you have very little rainfall between the first timing and the flagleaf timing, the need for anything expensive, or the need for even the rate of fungicide being applied that you might have applied in a wet season, will be reduced come flagleaf. And really that 3rd option is, I think, like I say, mainly for Tasmania. Okay. In summary then, what can we do about fungicide resistance? Well, the first thing is, if we don't use fungicides, we don't have a problem with resistance. Now, they weren't manufactured or discovered in order for us not to use them. But if we can limit the number of times we use them, that's got to be good for their future use in integrated disease management packages. If we can, try and avoid using the same active ingredient more than once in a growing season. Try ring the changes just like you've become more familiar with things such as herbicides. The minute that you're onto a good thing, change it to something else that's equally good but different. Where disease pressure is high, look at making sure that we've got 2 modes of action going into the system. And although it's not the same as 2 modes of action, trying to rotate those group 3 DMIs may have small effects at delaying resistance development in the early stages. So if you're using epoxiconazole successfully, try and alternate it with something else every so often. Or if you're using prothioconazole, try and use something different the next time around. It's easy to talk about mixing, but some of the products we're mixing are triazoles, our epoxicanazoles, our opuses, our prosaros. Some of the things we mix or might mix with them are themselves at high risk of resistance. So try, if you can, to avoid using those group 7s that have good foliar activity, such as Sustiva or Aviator Expo, let's try using those just once in a season if we can. And the same with the QOIs. Let's try and use those strobes once in a growing season. In summary then, Septoria tritici is an issue for us for many reasons, but we now have this added reason of mutations that are rendering some of our DMIs less effective. So let's try and pull all the levers we can to actually get this integrated disease management approach. Cultivar resistance, things like cultural control, even grazing can actually reduce our disease pressure. Try not to grow the most susceptible variety as being the earliest sown in your portfolio. Key timings, start of stem elongation and flag leaf for most HRZ regions on the mainland, with that exception in Tasmania of perhaps needing a third spray. Monitor the situation between the first spray at 31, 32 and the second spray at flag leaf so that you know your risk, and remember that aspect of latent period and thermal time. Okay, just a reminder, you can ask questions. I'm going to be running out of time, but I'm going to just now move on in less detail to net blotch and powdery mildew. Some sinister things happened on the York Peninsula in SA last year. That was that the susceptible variety Spartacus CL, which was susceptible to net form and net blotch, actually showed up that Sustiva or fluxaperoxide, the new seed treatment SDHI, was not working. This was highlighted to the state pathologists, Hugh Warwick and Tara, and they actually responded, got CCDM involved, and it resulted in over 400 isolates being sampled across the York Peninsula. And what they found looked like this. And that was that they found that there were isolates in the lab that clearly showed up as having reduced sensitivity and resistance to the SDHIs, fluxaperoxide. We strongly suspect that those isolates that had the mutation that rendered them resistant to fluxa would also have the same effects on any other SDHI foliar fungicides, such as Aviator Expo. You can see that the majority fall in this category of the York Peninsula as having reduced sensitivity. However, around Minleton, you can actually see a high level of the proportion of the population that's actually showing resistance to fluxaperoxide. The same isolates were also tested to see what their susceptibility to the DMIs was like. And this was even more shocking in that what was found was that tebuconazole had certainly moved such that there was an indication that whilst other DMIs might not be affected to just the same extent, there was certainly evidence that the population of net form of net blotch, net form, not spot form in this case, had actually moved from being sensitive to the DMIs to having a high level of reduced sensitivity, and in the case of tebuconazole, resistance. Now, in fairness, tebuconazole is not a great product against net form of net blotch. But what these results show is the degree of shift in the population towards resistance. We know from those same isolates that 20% of those isolates actually showed reduced sensitivity to both the SDHIs and the DMIs. So that means that when it comes to form of net blotch in the high rainfall zone, let's be really monitoring our crops closely, because we need to be aware of these changes that have occurred in SA this last year. Just over 4% were actually resistant to the tebuconazole and the Sativa or fluxapyroxide seed treatment. Now, there's no suggestion at this stage that form of net blotch resistance to SDHI fungicides is widespread outside of South Australia. But we know that other places in South Australia, we've found those mutations at low levels in the population. So if you're using the likes of SDHI, such as the Sativa seed treatment, which for us in some of our trials worked very well in southeast South Australia last year, if you're using those, be on the lookout for anything that just doesn't seem right that you can't put down to application. And please share us in your experiences and connect with your local pathologists in SA, in particular, the likes of Hugh and Tara, and also Grant Holloway and Mark McLean in Victoria. And I'm keen to hear too what you're experiencing. I'm going to finish with just a few other observations. And the first is what's happening in WA takes resistance to the DMIs to a new level. Most of what we've talked about so far is changes in the binding site of the DMIs in diseases such as Septoria tritici. But in WA, the net blotches are actually acquiring the next level of resistance to the DMI, which is not just target site mutation, it's actually an overexpression of the gene that produces the factory that produces the cell membrane. So that is quite sinister, because that will confer even more effect on those DMIs we're using, and there are parts there where clearly we've moved into field resistance, good and proper. Lastly, powdery mildew. If you're using strobilurins such as Amistar or Paraclostrobin, be aware that there's high levels in many parts of the high rainfall zone of SA, and outside of the high rainfall zone, in fact in SA up to Butte, where the strobes just aren't working. And this is just one mutation, the G143A mutation. So if you're using a mixture to combat mildew, remember, if it's got a strobilurin in, the only part of that mixture that's working for you is the DMI. Lastly, and it's a real important message, remember that fungicides are only part of the pyramid to control disease. And one of the ways we can make them last longer is trying to ring the changes and rotate our modes of action. And that's difficult when DMIs are the backbone of everything we do. But using those mixtures, particularly when disease pressure is high, keeping the label rates in that label rate run, and making sure that when we've got high disease pressure, we're using the full label rates to make sure in that label rate range to control the disease. But most of all, base your fungicide top of the pyramid on other levers that you can pull. You know, your crop rotation. You know that barley on barley is going to be a problem for you, particularly if you're growing, say, Spartacus on Spartacus, which hopefully you're not, or planet on planet. You're just elevating that disease pressure. And lastly, when you're picking that variety, try and get some feel for what the prevalent diseases are, so you can pick the more resistant candidates. I'd love to thank the rest of the AFREN team for bringing this to you today, and I know you'll have listened to others. I hope that I've been at least partially as useful as those. And just lastly, some of those that I'd like to thank with reference to this presentation particularly. Please connect with us and let us know what's happening out there, because without it, we won't have the eyes of what's happening in the industry. So please connect with us, let us know what's going on, and over to you, Kylie.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Nick. That was really, really informative. So I guess I'm just here, a quick reminder to send through any questions. I forgot to mention we'd do them at the end for the flow of the webinar. So we've got 3 more webinars coming up in Victoria. We have actually just set the date, so you'll see that date coming out soon. Western Australia, hopefully in the next month as well. And you can access the canola South Australia and New South Wales, Queensland ones online. And we want to hear from you if you're seeing fungicide resistance. So if you're in the high rainfall zone, feel free to contact Nick as a first point. We will have contact details for the team up on the website soon as well, so that you can try and identify who your local AFREN contact is. But we do like people to work through their local, plant pathologists, because they know their regions and they can go through whether there's any other agronomic conditions that could be causing the failures or the issues that you are seeing. Always good to include everyone. So we'll go to questions, and the first question is from James. So I think this is for you, Nick. So South Australian resistant powdery mildew grower is James, that's how he identifies. So how have Tasmania and other regions responded to reduce DMI sensitivity and strobilurin resistance? Are SDHIs being used, or are these weak on wheat powdery mildew?
A really good question, James. Generally speaking, I'd still say that we don't have really strong SDHIs in terms of powdery mildew. I would say that we're still going to be very dependent on making sure we've got good, robust doses of the DMI component that's still having some effect. So obviously longer term, moving away from those varieties that are giving us issues with regards to mildew, particularly mildew that climbs up onto the head of crops. Very often you can get mildew in the base of a crop, but it's that when the susceptibility allows it to move up the canopy onto the head itself. So don't rule out the DMIs themselves. You know, the products such as epoxyconazole, ciproconazole, that can still be effective provided the dose rate's high enough. Clearly, if you're trying to control a suite of diseases, one of the things I would generally say is that if I was looking at yield robbing capability, I would still worry more about Septoria and leaf rust in a high rainfall zone scenario than I would powdery mildew. So if you're using a combination of the DMI with an SDHI for the reasons of Septoria or leaf rust control, that little bit of extra synergy will help you. But to be perfectly honest, we are weaker in terms of having new products that might instantly slot in and take up the strain. So as it stands at the moment, I think we're still very dependent on those DMIs, SDHIs, particularly if we've got other things that we want to control within the crop that we're dealing with.
Awesome, thanks for that, Nick. Also, so in regards to the trial data you showed earlier, we've just been asked if there was any reason for not including opera. So I think that's pyraclostrobin epoxiconazole in the trial, or is it not great on Septoria?
No, it is a good strong strobilurin on Septoria. We had a number of products over a number of years, and in fairness, one of the things that probably put us off was some of our earlier experiences in the rate range weren't as good as what we had expected from the European data that we had seen. But I would have to confer that since then we have done other work with pyraclostrobin and found it to be an effective strobilurin. It certainly in Europe always held its own as a Septoria fungicide. So no other reason than sometimes you just can't include everything.
Okay, brilliant. Good reminder for all of us, I guess. Okay, and just a reminder, if we don't get to your question today, you can send us a quick email if we definitely didn't get to it, and I'll be going through some of the notes afterward, just because we might run out of time. We're very popular today. The next question, I might go to you, Fran. Andrew has asked, how much earlier can resistance be identified in the lab before being identified in the paddock?
That's actually a very good question. It's a case by case, obviously, but generally we get to see resistance identified in the lab a couple of years, 3 years, 4 years before actually it becomes a problem in the field. Now that happens in general, but in some cases, actually it's the other way around. And actually lately, to prove me wrong, we're seeing more of the later, right? So we're seeing more resistance identified in the field before actually we come across the issue in the lab. So it's a case by case. As I said, normally it happens a bit earlier in the lab, but lately it's happening a bit. It's happening in the field first. I guess that we always can actually be a bit proactive, right, and monitor our crops. And when you see that your fungicide, your treatments are not working as you were expecting, there are a number of reasons because that's happening, right? But it's always actually a good thing to do to just have a look. If you suspect that you've got potential resistance, don't wait until it really actually blows up in your face. Test the sample, right? So there are different mechanisms to do that, and I think it's a good thing to be proactive.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that, Fran.
Can I make one comment there, yep. Kylie? And that is that one of the things we're very dependent on right now in these next couple of seasons is any evidence that anyone has in the field after they've discounted some of the things that Fran's talked about that can be responsible for poor results. But if you've discounted them and you've been disappointed with how the QOIs are controlling Septoria, it's absolutely imperative that we get to hear about it, because those changes will occur very quickly. And I know from New Zealand that a number of people went out in 2013 and applied QOIs before we had the lab results to actually say that they wouldn't work. So we're really dependent on this great new community that we've got around AFREN to actually highlight the high risk scenarios, and that's one that I believe is high risk, particularly in the HRZ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. Yeah, we're always stronger together, and I think sharing information will help us get on top of it far quicker. So the next question is from John, who's from down in the Stirlings here. So what are the best options for spot type or spot form net blotch control in high rainfall zone barley, and the best timing?
Well, that's something that probably relates to one of those last slides that I showed, which is there are some very sinister things happening with regards to the net blotches, spot and net in WA, and Fran may like to comment on them. I'll comment on the timings, I suppose that the first aspect is that timing-wise, the start of stem elongation in barley is always a very effective timing for foliar diseases. So that window of growth stage 30, 31, it can be slightly earlier than we think of for wheat, which is possibly 31 to 32. So Zadok's growth stage, early stem elongation, growth stage 30 to 31 is a key timing to come in and protect yourself from that disease. The other aspect is that if it is a very high disease pressure due to either stubble or susceptibility of the variety, then that is where we have seen the use of the fluxoperoxide seed treatment in Sustiva actually working effectively to control net blotch. But remember, if you can, not to then repeat use that in future years in high risk scenarios, particularly if you're not applying any other fungicide to follow up, because that's the quick route to what we're seeing currently in York Peninsula, which is that the pathogen starts to overcome the fungicide. So start a stem elongation, unless it's very high risk, in which case consider something at sowing, and that something to date has been most effectively fluxoperoxide. I don't know, Fran, with regards to what's happening with the DMIs, whether you want to comment on whether any of those DMIs are more effective one than another.
Yeah, so look, I think that this ties very well with your presentation, Nick. So not every fungicide is affected in the same way. So we have seen that from Nick's slides, and this is something that is actually agreed within the different research communities working on these issues. So it is very important to keep in mind the level of disease, right? So because actually we can be misguided in some cases. We assume that the fungicide is not working, in this case a DMI, just because the disease level is very high and we are not using the right level rate. I think that there was also a very good comment from Nick on that. So with regards to the compounds that are more affected in Western Australia, so basically, obviously, Nick was saying that terbinafine is not a good compound for controlling net blotches. We know that. We use it as an indicator of resistance, but it's a mixing partner in some compounds are used for the control of net blotches, right? So terbinafine is always, very affected by all these mutations. That's the reason why we use it as an indicator. But then we've got compounds like epoxyconazole and propiconazole that are affected to a lesser extent, but still affected, right? So what I'm trying to say is that if you get to use epoxyconazole and propiconazole in paddocks with a high frequency of resistant strains, you are going to see a decline of the effect of the treatment. So you will experience that. It will be actually something that you can measure, right? Now, we haven't unfortunately to this stage run trials in the field where we have tested all the DMIs that are currently available. That's something that's a gap that we have to fill very quickly. And the reason for that is because this is relatively quite recent. These pathogens are evolving very quickly in the field in the last few seasons. So Nick was showing before in a slide where he was talking about the different mechanisms of actions. So the first one was target mutations. Then we've got overexpression in there, and we've got a few more that we are currently characterizing in the lab. So this is very dynamic, okay? So the minute that we've got this information, it will be made available. But just to cut the whole thing a bit, short, terbinafine. So expect that compounds with terbinafine as a mixing partner can be affected, right? If you're using any sort of formulation that contains terbinafine in a very resistant population, the majority of the activity is going to be on the other compound. It's going to be performed by the other compound. So be Keep this in mind. And then compounds, formulations containing epoxiconazole, propiconazole are going to be affected to a lesser extent, but in a similar way, meaning that you're going to see a reduction in their efficacy.
I think generally, Kylie, it's worth also pointing out that prothioconazole, if we just look at the DMIs across the board, prothioconazole that sits in Prosaro as a branded product, it's the prothioconazole that is generally speaking globally a very good barley fungicide. Net Blotch is included, and so remember we still have that DMI mixed with SDHIs in the shape of products such as Aviator X-Pro in the West that effectively go with propiconazole and epoxiconazole as Franz mentioned.
Yep, and then it's just the trick of rotating effectively so you're not putting that pressure on.
Exactly right.
Yep, no worries. Okay, so we're just on the hour. We're just going to cover maybe 2 or 3 more questions. It will be recorded if you have to run. We won't hold that against you, but this way, if you want to come back to this last bit of the webinar later, you can. So I'll just go on to the next question of, bit for Nick, bit for Fran. How close are we to Septoria resistance to epoxiconazole, and how do we know if we have it and to what degree?
Right, there's a lot of questions in there. I'd say in terms of Septoria, at this moment in time, I don't feel I've seen any evidence from the field in those regions I've been working where the disease is problematic, so Tasmania, Victoria, South Australia. I'd have to say, and that's as recent as 2019, I haven't seen anything that would suggest that we're close to resistance, meaning that epoxiconazole or a branded product that contains epoxiconazole like Opus wouldn't work. I don't think we're close in that respect. I think where we are with epoxiconazole is on that slow journey towards higher levels of reduced sensitivity with epoxiconazole. But I can tell you last year in southeast South Australia, where we had a lot of Septoria and leaf rust pressure, that epoxiconazole at its top rate of 500 mils was performing as well as some of the combination products at their lower rate range. And it's important to recognize that if you apply 2 modes of action, it's still important to have the appropriate dose. So when you have very often a combination of 2 products, look for how much active ingredient you're applying, because if you've automatically reduced the rate because it might have been a more expensive product, you could be doing yourself a disservice, even though you've done the right thing and picked 2 modes of action, if that makes sense. So at this moment in time, unless, of course, you as an audience know that you've seen stuff that worries you, I'd say, yes, we've got evidence that perhaps epoxiconazole is just slightly less effective than it once was, but I wouldn't say that we're close to resistance in Septoria. One other point, it's the curative activity of that fungicide that you're likely to see the drop-off in more pronounced if you have got an increasing problem that's showing in the field. In other words, you apply a flag leaf spray, but the leaf below was infected earlier. It's in the leaf below that you perhaps will note that it's not giving you as good kickback, as we call it, or control after the infection event as you might have been used to.
Okay. Yep. Brilliant. It's a complex world out there, but thanks for clarifying some of those things. I just have one here maybe for Fran, and we've touched on it a little bit. Is there subgroups amongst the triazole resistance? And if a mutation is resistant to a DMI, will a different DMI have a different efficacy?
Yeah, so as you said before, I mean, we have touched already on this briefly. There are groups in terms of resistance. Just think about resistance as when the mutation occurs, the target of the fungicide is going to shift a little bit. So the structure is gonna change a little bit. So that change in the structure is gonna make that different compounds that before were binding very well now are gonna actually have a bit more difficulties to bind properly. But that difference in binding can actually be more dramatic for some compounds than others, right? So if you look at for example, the group 3 fungicides, which is, as Nick was defining them before, the backbone of the fungicides available for, everybody everywhere, and not just here in Australia. So the structures can be very, very similar or can be extremely different, right? They all target the same enzyme, the same factory as Nick was defining it before, but they can be quite different in their structure. So the mutations are going to affect the binding of the different fungicides in a different way. So yes, so that's really why we really need to monitor for mutations, because knowing which mutations are developing and are more prevalent in the field provides us with key information on which fungicides are more or less effective. Okay.
Yep, no worries. So a good reminder, yeah, to get in contact if you're seeing anything in the field again. This will be our last question, and as I said, I'll follow up on some of the others that have come through outside of the session. Another one for you, Fran. Are there any key differences in the underlying principles for managing fungicide versus herbicide resistance?
Okay, so there are many differences, right? But two key differences are at the genetic level, right? So the two organisms that we're trying to control are different, right? So genetically, plants are diploids or tetraploids. So basically means that they've got multiple copies of the same gene. Fungi normally are haploids, right? So this difference, which basically means that they normally have one copy of the gene, except for some cases. So this genetic difference is going to make that the evolution of resistance is going to be slightly different. In some cases, dramatically different, right? So this is a problem that we see quite a lot, and I get to see with my students here at the university when we've got questions around, well, why is it that we are recommended to use always the highest rate for controlling weeds in order to avoid resistance? And with fungicide resistance, our message is slightly different. Adapt your rate to the level of disease you've got. Because Nick was saying at the beginning of his presentation, the best fungicide, is actually, or the best way to avoid resistance is not to use a fungicide. So limit the applications. Well, that is also applicable to limiting the amount of chemical that you put on the crop, right? Now you have to adapt your rate to the level of disease you've got, because you don't want to have poor control because you've got too much disease and you're using, within label range, you're using a low rate, okay? So you have to adapt your rate to the level of disease you've got. So that's the same, when you've got a low level of disease, you adapt your rate to that level of disease. Because if you are using too much of a fungicide when you don't need it, that's extra selection pressure on the disease. Extra selection pressure, the only thing it's doing is just accelerating the rate at which fungicide resistance evolves, right? Now that's from the point of view of the genetics, right? Now at the level of actually, the crop, you've got the management of the crop by other means. You've got other alternatives. I mean, if you've got resistance to net blotches, you can't change the crop really. You just grow wheat, and net blotch is not going to be a problem anymore. With weeds, it's actually hard to escape weeds in that sense, right? So you can rotate varieties as well. You've got different levels of resistance, right? And there are a few things that we can do to stable. So there are some cultural difference in the way that we can manage fungicide resistance that unfortunately are not available for weed resistance management.
Yeah, so that's a good reminder, yeah, to manage disease, to help manage fungicide resistance and all the levers. And I think you've spoken about the levers before as well, Nick.
Yeah, I think, you know, we have to remember that so much of what we're talking about is movement of resistance in genetic material over long distances. We're seeing that all the time in terms of regional spread of the problem. We talked about rust being potentially a social disease, so to speak, because of the long distances they traveled. But remember, if we've got spores that travel, it's important that we all row in and adopt these anti-resistance mechanisms as much as we possibly can, because there's a social side to fungicide resistance, that's for sure.
Yeah, so good fences make good neighbours, good fungicide resistance makes good, well, management, not good fungicide resistance, good fungicide resistance management makes good neighbours as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Awesome. So with that, is there any final comments from Nick or Fran before we leave today? I'll start with you, Nick.
No. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity again to talk to you. And like I say, let us know what you're finding out there. And I emphasize again, it's field experience combined with lab that will make us very strong. And that's why we're, you know, so lucky to have both CCDM expertise, which is some of the best in the world, combined with good field applied science is really the way to be ahead of the game here.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Nick. And Fran?
Oh, yes, basically fully agree with Nick, and I'd like to thank all the experts that are participating within this project. But also, you know, I would like to thank, you know, all the participants in these events, right? And we really appreciate your comments, your questions, your feedback. And something very important for us, we need to keep an eye on the crops. The more access to information you've got from the field, the more robust the recommendations are going to be. So we need to know whether, you know, a recommendation is actually going down well, is fitting with the expectations, is fitting actually with the local management, because, you know, this project is about local management of fungicide resistance and also much about a national management. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and yeah, just keep sending your questions, please.
Awesome. So thank you so much. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege to work with all of these guys and get the information to you. So as Fran and Nick have both said, we're really keen to hear from you, really keen to connect and make this as relevant as possible to your conditions. So with that, I'll bring today to a close. Thanks to everyone. And you'll get an email in the next day, just linking you to the recording if you're after it, and to the website. And also would encourage you, we've got a survey up at the moment to help us assess the baseline of fungicide resistance knowledge in Australia so we can deliver the best extension we can. Alrighty, thanks guys, we'll close now.